Hello, everyone. Welcome to History Tea Time Chat, not live with me, Philippa Lacey Brule. As I speak to you now, as I'm in front of you, if you're watching at my normal time of 3 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, UK time, I'm actually travelling down to London because I am taking the Anne Boleyn tour, which starts tomorrow, the 16th of May, and runs through till the 20th of May. So if you want to follow me along on that, please do. Mostly post to Instagram and Facebook. So Instagram, I'm at British_history_tours. And on Facebook, I'm just British History Tours. So you can follow along the tour on there if you would like. You are more than welcome. It would be very fun to have you. But I can't leave you for a week without this. So thank you very much for joining me. Thank you also if you are listening on the catch up later on or indeed on the podcast. There's quite a few history anniversaries this week, and I've picked on two to go over. There's quite there's quite a lot of information to go over. So I'm going to talk about Edward Jenner giving the first documented vaccination against smallpox. And I'm also going to talk about a different anniversary on the 19th of May, and that is of the release of Elizabeth, who would later on become Elizabeth I, her release from the Tower of London. The 19th of May, for many of you will know, is the anniversary of the execution of Anne Boleyn, hence why I have organised the Anne Boleyn tour to coincide with a visit to the Tower of London on the 19th. But so anyway, we are going to cover those two things. Of course, we are in Anvent at the moment. You'll notice lots of posts that we get this time of year, of course, with the run up to Anne's execution on the 19th. When I get back from tour, what I would like to do is talk about, is there actually anything more we can know about Anne Boleyn? And for those of you who are sort of maybe Anne Boleyned out, it's going to be also more of a general discussion. Because her story is so well known, and yet there is so much more being uncovered all of the time. I do the Anne Boleyn tour every year. This year we've done it twice. We're doing it twice. I've done it already, and we're doing it again. And it will also run twice next year. It is never the same in that we have historians come along and speak to us, and their research is ongoing, and we have different speakers. So I won't go into it too much now, but because I want to talk to you about it after I come back from the Anne Boleyn tour. But it goes to show that history is ever evolving in terms of our understanding. Different disciplines come in and give us new understanding about something that we thought we knew. So yeah, sorry, excuse me, sniffing. I have a bit of hay fever. I do apologize. I'm sure someone will pull me up on that if I don't. I got pulled up for saying the other day. You try it. Also yesterday, in fact, my interview with Estelle Perron about her new book, which looks at Anne Boleyn's time at the French court and her connections to the French court for all of her life. I've interviewed Estelle, and that is now live on my YouTube channel and the podcast. So please do check that out. It's very interesting. Again, in fact, that is one of the things that a piece of evidence I would use to show that we are always finding out more about stories that we think we already know. But for today, I am going to talk about, first of all, Edward Jenner's first documented vaccination against smallpox. Here is the man himself. He administered the first, like I said, his first vaccination on the 14th of May, 1796. Edward Jenner was a country doctor from Gloucestershire, not that far away from me. In fact, I worked for 12 months in Berkeley, which is the town that he came from. and had his house there and died there, actually. I think he was born and died there. Um, it's a very nice little village. I unfortunately worked at the, nuclear power plant, which was further on down the road, but there you go. Now Jenna were having come from the countryside, was very aware of this, law, LORE, that, um, anyone who'd caught cowpox, which people often did, and sometimes the story sort of goes that it was milkmaids, who he sort of observed, and I'm sure that came into it, although apparently it's not all of it. But anyway, cowpox is causes blisters on a cow's udders, and so obviously a milkmaid would come into contact with them, and she might catch cowpox, or anyone working with the cows could potentially catch cowpox. And it was sort of a known thing that they then seemed to have a uh, some sort of resistance to smallpox. Now, I am not going to show any pictures of smallpox on here today. Um, if you want to look up smallpox, there are a plethora of uh, photographs and there's lots of information about it. I just warn you, it is very shocking when you see someone um, suffering from smallpox. Now, cowpox was a much, much milder version. And so Jenner got to thinking, and he was a very cooperative man. So I don't think this was completely in isolation of anything else. But he observed this and devised this experiment to see if you purposely expose someone to cowpox, would it lead to them having a immunity against smallpox? So cowpox not being very serious, I'm sure unpleasant, but smallpox being incredibly serious, killing 1 in 11 people overall who caught it. If in children specifically, it would kill 1 in 3 children who caught it. It would leave a third of those who survived it blind, and anyone, well, lots of people would be left with incredible scarring. I think so. Queen Anne, the final Stuart queen, she lost 2 children to smallpox, and her husband George um, had ongoing lung issues after having smallpox. It was nasty, very, very nasty. And so Jenna devised this experiment. There was a lady, a dairymaid, a milkmaid called Sarah Nelms, and she was suffering from cowpox. And this occurred in May 1796. And so, oh, and also the cow has gone down in history. We know the cow's name that she caught it from. The cow's name was Blossom. um, so excuse me. So Jenna actually took some fluid. Right, I hope you're not eating, by the way, at the moment. Took some fluid from Sarah's cowpox blisters and scratched it into the skin of a young boy called James Phipps. He was 8 years old. A blister rose up on the spot, but James soon recovered. And a month later, at the beginning of July, Jenner inoculated the boy again, this time with smallpox matter, and no disease developed. His theory, his hypothesis, had been proven correct. Um, so the fact that this comes from cowpox, this is how we get the word vaccination, which hadn't been a word used before that. It was inoculation or variolation, I think is how you say it. And it comes from the Latin for cow, which is vacca, and that, so Blossom, thank you to Blossom, we have the word for vaccine. Uh, and so famous or so revered is her contribution to vaccinations that her horns they're actually kept at the Jenner Museum in Berkeley, and her hide is in St George's University, London. There is also a pair of horns in the Worcester Medical Museum as well that apparently they claim are hers, but there you go. That's what happens. Um, so yes, so Jenna this can Jenna can attract criticism because it sounds, on face value, absolutely awful that he took an 8-year-old boy and effectively experimented on him. So if I give you a little bit of context, because um, this put this into perspective when I found it out. So um, Jenna had gone to school in a place called Wootton Under Edge, also a place that I lived actually for 6 months while I was working at Barclay. And he was inoculated against smallpox while he was at school. Now, this was inoculation had been introduced into England by Lady Mary Montagu. And she'd observed this method while she'd been in Turkey, where her husband had been stationed as a British ambassador, as the British ambassador, excuse me, in Constantinople, now in Istanbul. And she had had her own son inoculated. She had managed to persuade George I to have his grandchildren inoculated. And once the royal family adopted it, the practice grew. Hence, Jenner having received an inoculation for smallpox whilst he was a child in his small hometown of Wootton Under Edge in Gloucestershire. And he actually had health issues that remained for the rest of his life from this procedure. So, in fact, what Jenner was trying to do is come up with a safer alternative to introducing smallpox matter to each child. And FIPS would have undergone the usual inoculation process anyway. And so, yes, he was infecting him on purpose with a virus, but it was in order to give him protection against a much, much more serious illness. His work wasn't accepted by everyone. We see the rise of the first anti-vaccine lobbies and anti-vaccine propaganda. The vaccine actually became. Let me show you this. Next slide, if you want to see some of the propaganda. There's a cartoon here, and it's showing people receiving the vaccine and cows growing out of their limbs and faces and buttocks. So they went to town on with their imagination. But yeah, the vaccine became mandatory in 1853. And as cases became fewer, smallpox became perceived as a less threatening illness. And with that, anti-vaccine sentiment grew. There's also this rising idea of individualism at the end of the 19th and 20th century. And so it meant that by 1898, there was an 1898 and a 1907 Vaccination Act. And both of those included conscientious objection of parents as a reason for a child not to be vaccinated. So, yeah, and that's where we still are with it today. But it's estimated that vaccinations, this is, I think, pre-2020, vaccinations save between 3 and 4 million lives per year. So in let's say, quote unquote, ordinary circumstances. Jenner's work gained him the description of being the founding father of immunology. Britain became free of smallpox in 1935, but it wasn't until 1971 that it felt like we could drop the routine vaccination of infants. And the WHO announced on the 8th of May 1980 that smallpox was eradicated worldwide. And through his, like I say, through his work, to Jenner's got this title, founding father of immunology, but it's also speculated that by some that he has saved more lives than any other human in history. If you think as well how his work was built on to develop more vaccines against things like polio, whooping cough, measles, tetanus, yellow fever, typhus, hepatitis B, and many others in the same ilk. So he is deserving of a mention. And if you want to know more about Edward Jenner, we covered him in History After Dark last week. So we went into detail about him and his life and his work and his legacy. So check that out on History After Dark on YouTube. There's Lady Mary Montagu, and there she is with her son, who she took to Turkey. So, okay. So there's Jenner. That's what I wanted to cover about him today. Now, as I said, as we come up to the anniversary of Anne Boleyn's execution on the 19th of May, 1536, it took place. So the 19th of May is the anniversary, 488 years ago. She was executed after being found guilty of treason, adultery, imagining the king's death, which is where the treason comes from. There's no evidence, and unfortunately, it wasn't just her who was executed. 5 other men were executed with her. In fact, on this day, I think, or is it the 17th? Let me just check that. I don't want to give you a bum steer. Sorry, it's the 17th. That's right. I think the 15th was her trial. 17th, the men who were found guilty next to her were executed, including her brother, George Boleyn. So, of course, the 19th of May attracts all eyes onto Anne Boleyn and that awful fate, one that we, of course, explore every year in the during the Anne Boleyn tour, and really go into what happened. So that there is actually another anniversary linked to Anne, and that is the release of her daughter, Elizabeth. 18 years after her execution, Elizabeth was prisoner in the Tower and was released on the 19th of May. So let's get into that. So why was she in the first place? So I'm going to roll back a little. Edward VI died on the 6th of July, 1533. Edward VI was the son of Henry VIII by his third wife, Jane Seymour. Henry's 2 previous wives had also produced children who had survived to adulthood, but both of these marriages had been annulled on Henry's own insistence, and those children delegitimised. Those were, of course, Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. Let me get some pictures up. And Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, which he destroyed his first marriage and altered the ancient organisation of the Church of England in order to marry Anne Boleyn. Catherine had been banished from court, removed from her beloved daughter, barred even from communicating with her on Henry's orders. And toward the end of 1535, Catherine's health had deteriorated. She retreated into her rooms at Kimbolton Castle, determined to, because she wasn't confined to her rooms by anyone else. She sort of decided to embrace the fate of a prisoner. If that's what she was, that's what she would be. And she became increasingly unwell until around Christmas 1535, just after she'd turned 50 years old. Her condition took a turn very much for the worst, and she died on the 7th of January 1536. Now, initially, the court rejoiced in her death, which must have been incredibly painful for her daughter Mary. The pregnant Anne Boleyn was jubilant also. Her troublesome adversary, of course, was gone. However, as David Starkey points out in his book about Henry VI and his 6 wives, it did eventually dawn on Anne that Catherine, being alive, had actually kept her position secure. If Henry now got rid of Anne, and their relationship was showing severe signs of cracking, then had Catherine still been alive, there would have been immense pressure on him to get back with Catherine. No doubt he wouldn't have done it. But now that Catherine was dead, that put Anne in more danger because he could get rid of Anne and choose again. She wasn't a foreign princess like Catherine had been. So, I mean, she had France's backing, but not to the same degree as Catherine had had Spain's backing, and they didn't They couldn't do anything about it. So, and actually, if there's more about that in Estelle's book about Anne Boleyn and her relationship with France, and you know about France's role in trying to secure an annulment for Henry's marriage to Catherine in order for Anne and recognise Anne's marriage to Catherine. But anyway, it's Anne's marriage to Henry, sorry, not to Catherine. So we go into that in that interview. So I recommend you check that out after this. Anne's saving grace, though, as I've mentioned, was she was pregnant. Having given birth to a healthy daughter, Elizabeth, in 1533, she now, of course, would be producing that longed for son, and her position of queen would be in no doubt. But on the 29th of January 1536, as Catherine's funeral was taking place at Peterborough Abbey, Anne miscarried. Anne would be dead herself within 5 months of Catherine, executed, as I say, by beheading at the Tower of London after being found guilty on all those generally accepted to be trumped up charges. I mean, they're insane. Like, just to go off on a tangent, the dates where she was supposed to be places, she was provably not in those places. Yeah. That's a whole video in itself. Before the month of May 1536 was out, Henry had married Jane Seymour. He'd been communicating with Jane throughout Anne's incarceration at the Tower. Anne had been taken there on the 2nd of May, and Henry had just been assuring Jane that I'll soon get word to you of Anne's condemnation and da da da, you know. And their betrothal took place the day after Anne's execution. Now, fortunately for Jane, she did bear Henry a son, Edward, born on the 12th of October 1537 at Hampton Court Palace, in a room that I've been very fortunate to go into on a number of occasions now. We're going to be there again this weekend with Tracy Borman, who's giving us a talk in there. We managed to get in there on the Anne Boleyn tour quite often. Can't always be guaranteed, but I'm very fortunate that I've been in quite a few times with my groups. Like I say, though, the birth, though, killed Jane. She died in the same room she had given birth 12 days after she'd given birth. Edward, her son, became king at the age of 9. He was crowned on the 20th of February 1547 at Westminster Abbey, but he was not to see adulthood. In January 1533, he became ill with a cough, and over the next few months, his condition just got worse and worse. He was losing strength. He could hardly eat. He was very swollen, covered in ulcers. Contemporaries suggested a tumor perhaps in the lung, but something at least was affecting his lungs. Now, during these last few months, as it became clear that he would not survive, Edward drew up his device for the succession. And what that did was remove his half-sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, and he named Lady Jane Grey his successor. And he died at the age of 15 on the 6th of July at Greenwich Palace. He'd gone out to Greenwich thinking that, hoping that the fresher air out there would help him recover. Now, the reason he did his own device for the succession and that he had to remove his sisters is because his father, Henry VIII, had left a will, the first one of his kind, I believe, naming his daughters, Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, naming them in the line of succession after their half-brother. But crucially, he did not legitimize them at the same time. Now, this was a problem for Edward. Now, Henry had barred his elder sister Margaret's descendants from the succession, presumably because they were the Scottish royal family. Margaret had gone to Scotland to marry James IV of Scotland. But Henry had included his younger sister Mary's line. Now, Mary had at one time been the Queen Dowager of France. Did I get a photo of them? Let me see. I don't know if I did actually. No. Oh, should have done a Charles Brandon and Mary picture. But anyway, so yes, his younger sister, Henry VIII's younger sister, had gone to France to marry Louis XII. And Louis died very soon after the marriage. Henry sent his best friend, Charles Brandon, to go and get Mary. And it must have been known that this couple had already been fond of each other because Henry gave express instructions to Charles not to get engaged to Mary. Now, Mary had been promised that if she went to France to marry the aging king, Louis XII, that should she survive him, she'd done her kind of duty and she would be able to marry whom she wished next. So Henry must have known this. Um, so he sends his best friend. This was his mistake. Not only did Mary persuade Charles Brandon to become engaged, to be betrothed, the couple actually married in Paris against the express wishes of Henry. So they returned to England married. Brandon must have been the only person pretty much who could have got away with this behaviour with Henry VIII. But it is via their daughter, Frances, that we have the Grey line, because Frances married Henry Grey, 1st Duke of Suffolk, and they had 3 daughters, Jane, Catherine, and Mary. Edward was conflicted by his half-sister's illegitimate status, so he named Jane Grey, who he saw as having the requisite legitimate line. And thus he excluded his older sisters in contravention of his father's will. But he was king, so maybe why not? But it was expected by the majority of people that Mary would be the next in line. Lady Jane Grey is known as the 9 Days Queen, but in fact, she was queen for 13 days if you calculate it from the day that Edward died. The 9 days comes from the date that she was declared queen in London. And Jane had gone to the Tower for her in preparation for her coronation, as was tradition. But Mary raised a strong force, and she did have the general support of the public on her side. She marched to London, and Jane's supporters quickly deflected or fled, and she remained at the Tower, now a prisoner. Now, contrary to here she is, Jane Grey and Mary. Contrary to popular belief or misconception, she wasn't executed at that point. And she wasn't executed for assuming the position of Queen Regnant. It wasn't until after the Wyatt Rebellion, later on that year. In fact, if it wasn't for the Wyatt Rebellion, Jane might have lived, or at least lived for longer, because that failed rebellion against Queen Mary, which was the plan was to overthrow Mary and replace her with Elizabeth. And it had risen in opposition to Mary's decision to marry Philip, Prince of Spain. So Jane, as a figurehead of any Protestant rebellion, she's not named, but she's there. She could be a figurehead, and Mary probably felt like she had little choice but to have her execution finally arranged. And she did dither about it, but she was tried for treason along with her husband. She'd married Lord Guildford Dudley, son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, back in May 1533, just before she had become queen. She was tried for treason alongside her husband at London Guildhall on the 13th of November 1553, found guilty and condemned to death. And initially, like I say, there was a stay of execution while Mary pondered over whether she could go through with it, but eventually the sentence was carried out. She was beheaded within the Tower of London on the 12th of February 1554. She's buried in St Peter ad Vincula. But like I say, she wasn't personally involved with the rebellion. So the rebellion, though, therefore, would have major repercussions for another Protestant of the blood royal, and of course that would be Elizabeth, Mary's half sister, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. The concerns of the rebels about the marriage proposed between Mary and Philip of Spain, who would become Philip II of Spain when his father abdicated, but at the moment he was prince. Their concerns were that Spain is this significant Catholic foreign power, and so Catholicism already with the wheels in motion, but that England would become basically subservient to Spain and become fully Catholic. And as I've said, the rebellion didn't name Jane in their plans, but the plan was to overthrow Mary and replace her with Elizabeth. Elizabeth is named as part of their plan. However, Wyatt, who gives his name to the Wyatt Rebellion, refused, possibly under torture, to name Elizabeth as having anything to do with the plot. He possibly was tortured. He definitely didn't say anything. Then he didn't say anything on the scaffold to implicate Elizabeth in any of these. But Mary's counsel was suspicious, and Elizabeth was sent for. She was at a place called Ashridge, which is about 30 miles north of London. And on the 11th of February, three of Mary's men came into Elizabeth's chamber at 10 o'clock at night to inform her that she must be ready to leave at 9 o'clock the following morning. Elizabeth pleaded illness. She had actually been ill for a while, and was still ill. So, according to two physicians who had accompanied Mary's commissioners. But Elizabeth pleaded illness she'd already done this on a number of occasions. So Mary needed to know, was her illness real? And even if it was, did it prevent her from traveling? And they concluded that although she was suffering with something, she could make the journey. And the party left the following day, the 12th of February, the same day Lady Jane Grey was put to death. So Elizabeth leaves Ashridge on that day, possibly not knowing what happened to her cousin, Lady Jane Grey, but she was carried in a litter due to how weak she was. She couldn't ride a horse, presumably, and the entourage had to make many stops. The imperial ambassador to Mary's court, a man called Simon Renard, wrote to Prince Philip, informing him of a rumour that it was absolutely certain that Elizabeth was with child, and that was evidence of an unchaste life, and that she lived loosely like her mother. A vindictive reference to the charges which had been brought against Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, back in 1536, and who even the imperial ambassador at the time, a man called Eustace Chapuis, who hated Anne, he doubted the accusations to be true. But by this point, they were being used to stir up hatred towards Elizabeth. Elizabeth reached London on the 23rd of February, so you can see how long the journey took. And she was initially taken to the Palace of Westminster, where her retinue was reduced severely, and no one was permitted access to her except via Mary's guards. And Mary refused to see her sister also. She was surrounded by a council who were hostile to her half-sister. Clearly, the ambassador to Spain was very hostile towards Elizabeth, and Mary became convinced of Elizabeth's involvement in the Wyatt Rebellion to overthrow her. Now, there was no direct evidence, despite Renaud rather hopefully reporting that Wyatt had named her. What he had in fact said was that he had written to Elizabeth, but he hadn't had a reply. After while Elizabeth was at Whitehall, her another cousin, Margaret Douglas, who also didn't seem to like Elizabeth much, had the rooms above Elizabeth's, and she decided to install kitchens so that Elizabeth would be driven mad by the smells of the kitchen. So yeah, she had few friends at this time. It must have been incredibly difficult situation. And that intimidation, which had begun with that late night visit at Ashridge, continued with her being isolated at Whitehall. And then there was worse to come because she was moved to the Tower. Mary seems determined to break Elizabeth. There had been no firm evidence found to link Elizabeth with the plotters. Despite being threatened with the Tower, Elizabeth still protested her innocence. Perhaps Mary would have thought she would implicate herself in time. She was separated at this point from many of her servants, including Kate Astley, who'd been her governess since she was 4. Elizabeth was by now extremely distressed and pleading to see her sister, but her wish wasn't granted, and her pleas moved the men. So this is when they're trying to take her to the Tower, and they go to her and they say, "Right, Mom, the tide is up. We need to go. Tide and time wait for no man." And she puts on. She pleads with them so much to see her sister. That's denied. So she pleads with them that she could please can write to her sister, and they do allow it. Now, this letter, I apologize. I have got a picture of it and I haven't put it up, but I will share it. This letter is the famous Tide letter. It's quickly recognized by the diagonal lines drawn through it on the second page. That she drew diagonal lines through the remaining blank space to prevent any postscript being added. And it's known as the Tide letter because by the time she had finished writing it, the river had risen too high to be able to pass under London Bridge, and the journey had to be which is between Whitehall and the Tower of London. I should point out the tide of risen too high, and so her journey was postponed until the following morning. But Mary ignored the letter. She was incredibly angry at her council for allowing that to happen, for not following her orders. So Elizabeth was moved to the Tower on a very rainy Palm Sunday, 18th of March. And she entered the royal entrance. So, like her mother, it's been said that she comes in through Traitor's Gate. She doesn't. Excuse me a moment. She's brought in up the steps and through the postern gate of the Bywood Tower, the same way her mother had been brought in on the 2nd of May. And it's not known for certain where she was held when she was inside the tower, but many historians, including Nicola Tallis, who has written a brilliant book called Young Elizabeth, it's where I've done a lot of my research for today, and I will show you some book recommendations at the end, including Nicola's. But many historians, including Nicola and Tracy Borman, have suggested that Elizabeth was most likely kept in the royal apartments where her mother had been held prior to her execution, and that this might have been a very deliberate move on the part of Mary to increase Elizabeth's terror. Remember, she's trying to break her spirit. She's trying to get her to confess to what she thinks is undoubtedly her guilt. Now, she's in more comfort in the royal apartments than she would be in many different parts of the tower. But the rooms were tired and the contents were tired, and the place was in disrepair. During Elizabeth's incarceration, Thomas Wyatt, like I say, head of the Wyatt Rebellion, was tried at Westminster Hall Of course, he was found guilty, but again, nothing incriminating came out about Elizabeth. On Good Friday, Elizabeth endured her first interrogation. I'll come back to that one. She held, so she had counsellors meet her on Good Friday. This shows in such a religious court how important this was. So on Good Friday, she underwent her first interrogation by her sister's counsel. She held her nerve. She even got an apology from Mary's Lord Stewart, the Earl of Arundel, who had been suitably embarrassed by their line of questioning, which had tried to get Elizabeth to admit to planning to move from her house at Ashridge to another one of her houses, which she denied, and then followed up by asking, basically, what's wrong with me moving between my houses? What's that got to do with anything? And that got them suitably embarrassed to get her an apology. By the beginning of April, sorry, Elizabeth's severest opponents are beginning to admit that there's just not enough to warrant her being held in the Tower. But Mary is insisting. She's getting news apparently every day that arms and weapons were being amassed on Elizabeth's behalf. So there must be something to uncover. On the 11th of April, Wyatt was removed from where he'd been held in the Tower and he was executed on Tower Hill. And Elizabeth may well have been, but I would say from visiting the Tower, I think she would have been aware, definitely of something going on, and she would probably have been able to hear the crowds gathered on Tower Hill to watch the execution. Now, the slide I've got up at the moment is of the Tower Hill scaffold site. It's now a memorial garden to those who lost their lives at this permanent scaffold site. So within the Tower of London, it wasn't a permanent scaffold site. There wasn't one. The top of Tower Hill, this had become a permanent place of execution. And there you have Gareth talking to the Anne Boleyn tour that we just did about. He's there briefing them about the men who were executed in 1536. Not all the names are on the plaques around the side either, and we've got different theories as to why that is. But so yes, 11th of April, Wyatt is executed on Tower Hill. On the 12th of April, Elizabeth once again finds herself in front of the council. She again holds her nerve, and their efforts are fruitless. By mid-April, Wyatt's dead. The rebellion is becoming yesterday's news. There's no obvious reason to keep Elizabeth prisoner. Very slowly, Elizabeth is allowed a little more freedom. She's already been in there for weeks, but she's allowed a little more freedom to walk around the Queen's apartments. Later, she's also allowed to walk around the Privy Gardens. There was another prisoner here in the Tower at the same time. Robert Dudley had been held in the Tower since the previous summer when his entire family basically were implicated in the bid to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. He'd avoided the fate of his father and brother. Perhaps Elizabeth caught a glimpse of her future favourite, but there's no evidence that they actually met whilst they were both prisoners in the Tower, unfortunately. But again, another good book recommendation for a brilliant account of the Dudley family's involvement in the Lady Jane Grey saga. I recommend to you The House of Dudley by Dr. Joanne Paul. You can also watch my interview with Joanne on YouTube youtube.com/British history. Just have a look under historian interviews in the playlist historian interviews. There's Joanne in there, there's Estelle in there, there's Tracy in there, there's Gareth in there. There's lots of good ones to look at. But yes, you can see my interview with Joanne Paul about the Dudley family. But April gave way to May, and despite more of Mary's counsellors becoming vocal about the lack of evidence that they had to condemn Elizabeth, so therefore, what are they doing with her? Mary still acted like there's a decision to be made about what to do with Elizabeth. Freeing her didn't seem to be an option that Mary was willing to go for. Elizabeth, of course, was unaware of the deliberations going on in Mary's council. She still feared that she would be executed. And when the new lieutenant of the Tower arrived to take up his post on the 5th of May with a retinue of 100 liveried soldiers, she feared the worst, went into a panic, thinking that they had come to take her to the scaffold. Over the next few days, more of the rebels involved in Wyatt's rebellion were freed. Elizabeth remained prisoner. So this position, keeping her there, became increasingly untenable, and Mary agreed to release Elizabeth, but only to house arrest the Palace of Woodstock. Now, the date of Elizabeth's release was probably deliberately chosen, and it was the 19th of May, the 18th anniversary of her own mother's execution. So as I've mentioned, my interview with Estelle is out now, as of yesterday, in fact. Well, by the time this goes out, yesterday. Yes, that's right. Uh, and it's also available on the podcast, so please do check that out. It's a really good interview. I really enjoyed it. I always enjoy my interviews. I only interview interesting people. There's again. And these are the books that I would recommend if you want to delve into any of this story in particular, and Anne and Elizabeth's story more generally, but sort of linked to what I've been talking about today. Nicola Tallis's Young Elizabeth, most definitely. The House of Dudley, Joanne Paul, I've just mentioned. Thorns, Lust and Glory, which is Estelle's new book. And Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I by Tracy Borman. They're a very good place to start. Talking about books before I go, can I just please show you our next book club book, Elfrida by Elizabeth Norton. Elfrida is in fact Elfrith. Anyway, she was the first crowned queen of England. And it's a nice short one this time because there's a lot of Anglo-Saxon names to get your head round when you read it. We will be, excuse me, we will be meeting in July, 7th of July, I think it is. All you need to do if you want to come to book club is join my Patreon, patreon.com/British history. You get to take part in book club. You get to ask questions for future historian guests that I interview. I interview at least one a month. So you can put your questions to them. You get the interviews ad-free and extended. There's a little bit more on there for Patreon members. You get discounts on our online history festival tickets. You get early access, VIP early access to our tour tickets, and with some brand new tours coming up, you probably don't want to miss out on that if that is something that you are interested in. You get all of that for £5 a month, whatever that is in your currency, and you can cancel any time. I know people's situations change, and so yeah, it's all very flexible. Right, everybody, please do follow me on Facebook and Instagram over the next few days to follow the Anne Boleyn tour, and I will be back properly live next week. So that's the 22nd of May. I will be here. I will be answering your comments if you are also able to tune in live. But until then, take care, have a great week, and I will see you all soon. All right, bye-bye.